Hello everybody, and welcome to the first section on informal fallacies. These are the ones we're going to be covering: appeal to authority, inconsistency, the straw man, the false dilemma or either-or argument, begging the question or circular reasoning, suppressed evidence, and tokenism. A note about most of these fallacies. With informal fallacies, there's usually a version of them that is not, in fact, a fallacy. So, for example, we're going to be looking at appeal to authority. Appeal to authority is only a fallacy when the authority is faulty or false authority in some way. But appeals to legitimate authority are okay. And so typically, the reason why these are fallacies that people fall for is because lots of times there are legitimate ways to use them. Okay, so appeal to authority is actually what we're going to be looking at first. The definition is that appeal to authority is a fallacy that occurs when one takes as evidence for a claim the word of an alleged authority when doing so is not appropriate. So the authority might not be real, or the authority might be a real authority but just might not be appropriate or relevant in some way to the particular discussion at hand. So whenever you have an appeal to authority, here are some questions to ask. Is the authority of the appropriate or proper kind? The authority might be an expert in one subject, but not in the subject you're asking. And this is especially true in a lot of sciences and so forth, where you have very narrow specialized fields. You don't just have biology, for example. You might have specialists in birds, or specialists in fish, and so forth. Some authorities might be better than another. Have the authorities reached a consensus? If it's something that authorities are largely agreed upon, such as smoking is harmful, well, that's a very good appeal to authority then, if you have an expert in this. If, on the other hand, authorities are largely divided, for example, physicists who know a whole lot about quantum physics, disagree about the nature of gravity in some way as to, how it is, how it's caused and so forth, then perhaps if it's very much divided, an appeal to authority isn't necessarily going to settle the issue. Is it even something that the authority can know? Sometimes it might seem like something that might be related to the authority's field, but it's actually in some way beyond the authority's field. You're asking them to go beyond their expertise in some way. Also, do you really understand enough about what the authority is saying to draw the proper conclusions from the authority? Sometimes you might be tempted to draw the wrong conclusions for an authority, or somebody might cite an authority as if it supports their opinion, when if you really understood what the authority had to say, it wouldn't provide that kind of strong support. Okay, so here's an example of appeal to authority in a Sony commercial. You can go ahead and click on this, and it should open in a new window, and once you're finished, just click back onto the PowerPoint. Now here is the second example of appeal to authority, and I included this one because in this case the doctor really is an authority on medical matters, but he has a financial interest not to be perfectly honest with the people who he is speaking to, and he is going against the consensus of medical opinion and so forth. So this is a good example of how that can happen and how you have to be careful of even authorities who really are highly educated and have names in their field and so forth. So I suggest you watch this one. If you get easily offended by swear words, make sure you look at this. There's a little warning here. It is bleeped, but it's around the 3-minute mark, so you can always either just stop before the 3-minute mark, or if it being bleeped doesn't bother you, just go ahead and watch it, or what have you. I just wanted to give a quick warning about that. Alright, inconsistency. The definition of this is that one is inconsistent when one reaches a conclusion that accepts contradictory statements. So for example, suppose somebody says that John is taller than Sarah and that Nikita is taller than John, but still insists that Nikita is not taller than Sarah. That would be inconsistent. Now, a conclusion might be directly inconsistent, that is to say, somebody's conclusion might directly contradict one of their premises, Or a person might be inconsistent with other conclusions that they hold. For example, they might have reached two different conclusions, both of which are inconsistent with each other. For example, what if somebody holds the opinion that killing a human being is always wrong, but they're also for the death penalty? Well, one of those has to go. Now they can say killing is wrong except in particular cases, but then they have to give some sort of justification. So I'm not taking a position here about the death penalty. All I'm saying is that you can end up with two contrary conclusions that conflict with each other, and you would need some sort of justification or some more elaboration as to why they don't really conflict. One might be inconsistent with one's own past views. In other words, you might hold X at one time and then hold not X at another time. But of course, you should be careful with this, because changing one's mind for reasons is perfectly acceptable. That's a good thing. When one is given good arguments to change one's mind, one should change one's mind. That's what the whole point of arguing is. But sometimes people change their positions with the wind and don't realize they're doing it, or they're just doing it to fit in, or they're doing it to appeal to their audience, and so forth. So in politics, lots of times this is called waffling. If the politician legitimately changes their opinion because of evidence or because of a new argument, then that's one thing. On the other hand, if they're just sort of changing with the polls, then one thinks that perhaps they don't have principles of their own. So one of the ways just mentioned with this is that one might change their views just to suit the audience that they're talking to. So one might be inconsistent if one is talking to, for example, a politician talking to a group of people who tend to be, say, NRA members versus a group of people in a town where there's just been a school shooting or something like that. If they say completely different things relating to gun control, they're being inconsistent. They can't, both the things they're saying can't be legitimately held in many cases. Okay, so here is a little philosophical health check. You can click on the link below this area here labeled philosophical experiments, and what it'll do is it'll ask you about 30 questions, and it'll diagnose tensions and possible sources of inconsistency within your answers. So it's kind of fun, it's kind of interesting, it's certainly philosophical, so I recommend you try it out. Alright, the straw man fallacy is a very common fallacy. The straw man fallacy is committed when somebody attacks a weakened version of an opponent's argument, or a version they don't even really hold, as if it were really their argument. And then they say that since that argument fails, you should accept their argument instead. Sometimes this is called the tilting at windmills fallacy. This is from Don Quixote. For those of you who are familiar with the story, Don Quixote was sort of lost in his imagination. He took some windmills for actually being these giants on a hill, and tilting is what you call jousting, when you run at a lance with towards an enemy. And so he charged towards these windmills thinking that they were giants, but of course they're not a real enemy, they're a fake one. So that's where this comes from. It also goes by other names, knocking over card houses, all sorts of things like that. So you get the idea here. It occurs whenever you're essentially attacking a fake or weakened version of an opponent's argument. So here is an example. Suppose that somebody was arguing for the death penalty and against an opponent who was against the death penalty and said, "Of course I'm for the death penalty. I don't think that murderers should just be left free to roam the streets." What's the problem with this? Well, the problem is that people who are against the death penalty don't say that murderers should be left free to roam the streets. They tend to say that murderers should be punished harshly, very harshly. They should be oftentimes locked away forever, or whatever they say. They don't say that you should just let them out. So there might be lots of reasons to argue for the death penalty, but it's sort of a fake reason, or it's disingenuous to say that the reason why you should accept the death penalty is because that the alternative version, the opponents, say that we should just let murderers roam free. Here's an example of a straw man argument. It's from John Oliver, so please go ahead and view this, and of course you can click back when finished. Okay, a false dilemma, also known as the either-or fallacy, sometimes even called the black or white fallacy. In other words, you have to choose between one thing or another. This fallacy occurs when the arguer states or implies that there are only two options when there are really more than two. Okay, so sometimes there are real dilemmas. Sometimes you really only have two options. The fallacy only occurs when the arguer is saying that there's just two, when there are really more than two. So for example, either Min won the game of chess or she lost it. Well, this is a false dilemma because there's another option. She could have tied the game of chess. It could have been a draw. A true dilemma example would be that either Min won the game of chess or she didn't win the game of chess. And that's always going to be a true dilemma when you say something like either P, where P is a proposition, either P is true or not P is true. Either it's raining or it's not raining. Either it's May the 1st or it's not May the 1st. It can't be both P and not P at the same time. This is the basic law of non-contradiction. It was mentioned in another PowerPoint. And of course there are versions of this fallacy with, for example, the false trilemma, where the arguer implies that there are only three choices when there are more than three choices. So you can have a similar fallacy whenever the arguer implies that there are only a certain number of choices, when in reality there are more choices than that to analyze. So here are two examples of the false dilemma. One is from a Liberty Mutual Insurance ad, and another is from an old television show called According to Jim. This is a very common fallacy. You can find these all over the place. Again, lots of times you find politicians doing this. Lots of times you see it in commercials. So feel free to pause and watch these, and then go on with the PowerPoint. Begging the question. Begging the question, this is also known as circular reasoning, and this occurs when the conclusion of an argument is really contained in one of its premises. It might be contained directly, or it might be stated in just a slightly different way. So for example, and I took the example from the site below, Ralph Nader and Pat Buchanan are banging at the doors, and the political establishment, consisting of both politicians and the media, seems determined not to let them in on the grounds that they have no public support. This is when they wanted to be in on the public presidential debate. And the writer here is saying that this is a circular argument because one of the reasons they have so little support is that they are usually ignored by the press and most likely will be barred from the presidential debates, which require a base support of 15% of the electorate. So they can't get into the public debate because the press isn't supporting them, and the press isn't supporting them because they can't get into the public debate. So here's an example of begging the question where Elaine tries to simply define an old number as one that's been changed. So she's essentially trying to make what she says to be true by definition, and that's one way that begging the question often occurs. Alright, suppressed evidence. One is suppressing evidence when one leaves out relevant information or evidence contrary to the conclusion that is drawn. So this example is from the so-called History Channel's Monument Building Ancient Aliens, or rather it's from a person who is debunking this particular episode on the History Channel. And he essentially takes the History Channel's episode and goes through it bit by bit, stopping to say what's wrong with each little part of it. So the whole thing is about 3 hours long. Of course, you don't have to watch the whole thing. I know for a fact there are lots of good examples of suppressing the evidence in here. I just sort of jumped to a place in between the 13 and 18 minute mark. There are a couple examples, and really the whole thing is filled with this. This is sort of the History Channel's trick when they do episodes like this. So this is one of the major things they do. They do suppressing the evidence and false dilemmas an awful lot. So lots of times together. So please check this out. Just look at, you don't have to look at the whole thing. Just look at little parts of it. it provides a really good example of how evidence can be suppressed. Okay, tokenism. Tokenism occurs when an empty token gesture is mistaken for a legitimate one. Sometimes it's an empty gesture that others fall for, or sometimes it might be deliberate deceit on the part of some person. For example, suppose that I'm asked to make more of an effort to protect the environment, so in front of the person who asked me, I walk a few extra feet, throw my soda bottle into the recycling bin, even though I don't really intend to keep up the practice. That's a token gesture. Here's an example of tokenism from Blackadder III, a rather amusing one, so feel free to check this out. And that is the end of the presentation. The next PowerPoint I'll be making is on Informal Fallacies Part 2.